The Final Fantasy series is one of the most iconic and popular JRPG franchises of all time, with just the games themselves selling 161 million units worldwide as of June 2021. This popularity also extends into the speedrunning community, with basically every game seeing runners take on many different challenges they have to offer. In many of the games, runners have come up with ways to break the way they are played almost completely. Some games are broken through corruption of the game's memory, while others can simply use game mechanics to take down bosses with ease. In Final Fantasy X, though, strategies have evolved in a very interesting way. Today, we're going to dive into some obscure findings in the Final Fantasy X community and find out about how even 20 years after the game's release, the game has been finally picked apart thanks to the tireless efforts of those looking into the game's code. To understand what's going on now in the world of Final Fantasy X speedrunning, we need to take a look at the any% speedrun itself. For this example, we'll use Karakarn VI's groundbreaking sub 10-hour run on the PS2, which he obtained earlier this year. In the Final Fantasy X speedrun, the goal of the game is pretty cut and dry. Travel through Spira and gather the Aeons to help end the spiral of death, and deal with Tidus's daddy issues in the meantime. While the run's route is pretty linear, there are a few things that cause variance in how runners take on the game's fights. Stats and equipment are paramount to the success of an FFX any% run, and without focusing on these things, the run would be much slower than it is now. For example, winning the main story Blitzball tournament in Luca is important due to the prize being a strength spear, which helps immensely with Tidus's damage output for the rest of the game. But the Blitzball match itself can go completely wrong randomly, even with the right strategies being used. Other situations come down to whether you obtain a weapon that deals thunder elemental damage from a drop after the Obliterator fight, which allows either Tidus or Wakka to deal additional damage during the Extractor fight and Moonflow later on. Tidus's weapon being dropped from that fight is about a 1 in 4 chance, and Wakka's drop is about a 1 in 16 chance. These weapons can also be attained in Besaid or Kilika encounters, but the likelihood of getting these drops is extremely low. These equipment drops do save time, but they're not run killers if you don't attain them, as the current world record does not get these drops. Skipping ahead to the Calm Lands and after the Defender X fight, the real run killer at the top level comes from just under 8 hours into the run, and it's all because of this equipment. Encounters become pretty irrelevant after a certain point in the game, and the only reason many of them are taken in the run is to farm items to make bosses easier. Things like stealing fire gems are important thanks to the trio of 9,999 being used after the Remium Temple. There's a few points, however, where enemies are fought for spear grid levels, but characters get most of the levels from overkills on bosses. During late Mount Gagazet and onward, runners don't need them anymore. And this is where the Cavern of Stolen Faith comes into play. Normally, runners would avoid this cave since it's off the beaten path and doesn't do anything for the run. However, this is the first chance to find an enemy called a Ghost, and Ghosts can drop an equipment that has the No Encounters ability. The No Encounters ability is exactly as it sounds. Just equip the party member with the equipment that has the ability, and you have no random encounters for the rest of the game. It sounds easy enough, right? So why don't all runners do it? The only bad thing about trying to get this equipment is a Ghost has a 1 in 13 chance of appearing, and even then, the drop rate for peaceful equipment is only 5%. And you might be thinking, oh well, they can just run from encounters using Flee, so it can't be that bad, right? And you would be correct. Since buying the Sonic Steel from Wakka the 23rd in Macalania Woods gives Tidus the first action in every battle, thanks to the First Strike ability, battles effectively become safe. 12 seconds. That's how long it takes to completely go into an encounter, flee, and exit the post-battle reward scene. Now take that number and multiply it by about 14. That's the number of encounters you can get just before the Seymour Flux fight alone in the first part of Mount Gagazet. so you can see why Karakarn wanted this equipment to drop from the Ghost. In his world record run, he got the Ghost on his 3rd encounter. And not just that, but it was a first try drop from that encounter. So how long did it take for him to get this insane luck, you might ask? A year of grinding the any percent category. Karakarn basically grinded the game for a year to get this run with these strategies. Other runners watching were wondering if they could make the grind easier on Karakarn by looking more into how encounters and item drops work, and what they found was astounding. In March of 2021, runners by the names of Grey Fox and Mod Hayama did some testing for ghost encounter rates, and though they got similar results from their findings, there was one thing that was odd. Out of 1,000 encounters, 500 of which were for a green zone with a documented 10% chance, and 500 for a white zone with a documented 5% chance. The green zone had 61 ghosts encountered, and the white zone had 48 ghosts encountered. Grey Fox wanted to try again to make sure he didn't get really lucky, but another Final Fantasy runner, Sereth, suggested that encounter rates might be seeded. So what does that mean? Imagine that you have a set value assigned that basically determines all of your encounters in the game, and it's generated as you start up a file. That's basically what this concept is. At the time, no one had any proof of this, and it was just something that runners noticed with Nemesis %, where you have to capture 10 of every monster in the game, along with other requirements. They mentioned that sometimes they would see a runner having many encounters with an enemy, but another having a small amount of encounters with the same enemy. Now before I go any further, let's turn back time a little bit. A couple years as a matter of fact. Back to November of 2019. A Final Fantasy X runner by the name of Oddmog discovered he could use the PS4 system clock to manipulate a set seed in the HD remastered version. He would then complete a run with that clock manipulation. Though no one knew how this worked at the time, this was probably the first instance of someone taking the idea of seed manipulation and running with it. Researching the seeds would be a big undertaking, and could take weeks, if not months, of painstaking research. Fast forward a little bit to 2020, and there was more talk about the idea of seeds and the research around it, but nothing really came to fruition until more people started looking into it. Mariyama found back then that damage rolls at the beginning of the game were indicative of possible RNG seeds, and even duplicates of those seeds were found in additional testing. But there was one problem. In April of 2021, multiple runners started looking at seeds for both the HD remaster and the PS2 version of the game. And it was found that duplicate damage rolls were found quickly in the HD remaster, but for the PS2 version, no duplicates were found. This meant that it was possible that the RNG seeds worked differently between the two games. With some looking into more of the seeds, a runner named Crimson Inferno presented a tracker on April 10th to show when you could get a critical hit on the first boss fight, Sin-Spawn Ames. He manually tracked seeds to see when critical hits happened, so you could line up a critical hit with Tidus's Overdrive, Spiral Cut. This was useful because even though this was an early game boss, Ames casting Demi constantly is slow and can lose quite a bit of time. On the same day though, another runner named Rossi had a breakthrough with the PS2 version of Final Fantasy X as to how RNG seeds are created. Rossi wanted to look more into the actual RNG of the game to see if Karakarn's ghost encounters can be influenced in some way, making it easier for him to get those encounters. He figured out that it's based off of a formula that includes the system clock, the number of frames since the game is booted, and that it gets set sometime after hitting New Game on the main menu. Rossi broke it down even further by stating that there are a lot of seeds, and the best way to narrow the amount of seeds down is to start the game as soon as possible. If you hit New Game within a minute of getting control of your cursor, you end up with 1 out of 226,378 seeds. If you hit New Game within 1 second, you end up with 1 out of 7,555 seeds. In the midst of these discoveries, Rossi also starts to figure out more of the RNG values themselves. For several games that we've covered on this channel so far, these values are pretty tame, with only 2 or 3 in the game's memory that affect random things in the game. For Final Fantasy X though, how many do we have? 10? 20? 50? How about 68? It was later found that there are 68 different values that affect random aspects of the game, with each value being attributed to something unique in the game's memory. It was found out that there were RNG values that affected enemy drops, encounter formations, and camera angle RNG. Believe it or not, it's actually more simple than it seems. But before we go into how these things work, let's look at the RNG seeds overall. In May of 2021, Crimson Inferno posted his completed seed spreadsheet, letting people be able to see what possible seed they had for the remastered version. It wasn't 100% of all the seeds, but it was enough that people could use the spreadsheet to find out what seed that they might be on. This was only really useful for damage rolls to start, but Rossi took this a step further with the PS2 version and made a ghost encounter tracker based on the first 6 attacks in the game. Using those numbers, it tells the player what number of encounter the ghost will appear on in the Cavern of Stolen Faith. All the player needed to do was to count the number of encounters they got in their run, and they can make the ghost appear on that specific encounter number. Even though this didn't incorporate the no encounter equipment drops needed to destroy the endgame, it was a big step as to knowing when the encounters would happen. Unfortunately, Karakarn got his PB the day before Rossi got his tracker working. This was the initial reason why Rossi started on this project in the first place, but this wouldn't stop him from continuing the endeavor. This would only be the beginning, however, as Rossi would look into how drops actually worked in the game. There are 3 different RNG values that control drops out of the 68 that were mentioned, and another that controls whether it's a rare drop or not. The RNG values for drops are called RNG 10, RNG 12, and RNG 13. And RNG 11 is used for the rare item drop roll. To be a little more specific, RNG 10 determines the item 1, item 2, and equipment drop chance, as well as deciding if stealing an item will succeed or fail. RNG 12 determines the equipment owner, the type, the number of slots, and the number of abilities. RNG 13 actually determines the abilities for equipment. This is where things get a little more complicated, so let me break it down for you. Basically, when these RNG values are used, it does something called a roll and advances the RNG value. For RNG 10, this is directly controlled by the player's actions, as it can be advanced by character and monster deaths with a count of 3 advancements. Stealing also advances RNG 10 once. Moving on to RNG 11, if you get an item as a drop or a steal, RNG 11 advances for every item to determine if it's rare or not. RNG 10 can be compared to the drop table mechanic in Zelda 1 speedrunning. When you kill an enemy in Zelda 1, you get a specific item that's based on the kill count and an enemy grouping. Even though this isn't the same, you can kind of see the parallels in the concept. Back to Final Fantasy X, RNG 12 rolls 4 times for each equipment drop if there is any, 1 roll for each of the 4 things that it determines, which I mentioned earlier. RNG 13 rolls for each ability that was generated during the RNG 12 process. Now that the main RNG values for drops were discovered, and the Ghost Encounter tracker was made for the PS2, it was time to dive into the PC version. Crimson Inferno gave Rossi a lot of his data he had already collected, and a few things were discovered almost immediately. Remember how I said that the PS2 has an absurd amount of seeds with little chance of getting a duplicate, and the HD version saw many duplicate seeds? It turned out that parts of the memory that the HD version read, like the PS2 read for the frames since the game was booted, were just a value of 0. So what does this mean? That took the amount of seeds from about 2 to the power of 32 to just 256. And just a couple of days after finding that out, Rossi had mapped every single seed on the remaster version. The encounter tracker was updated for the PC version for runners to use, so now ghost encounters could be easily tracked for each seed. Oddmog and some other runners ended up confirming that this tracker worked, solidifying all the work that Rossi and Crimson put in to making this a reality. Now that this was done, they now had to face their next question. If the ghost encounter could be mapped, then why not the rest of them? In order to make this happen, Rossi would need information on every encounter table like for the areas in the Cavern of the Stolen Faith. Then include forced encounters that runners take, as well as some of the possible Guado encounters during the Macalania Temple escape. So Rossi kept at work with parsing through the information in the game's code, And on June 17th, 2021, he posted the first 1,000 values for the RNG-1 Encounter and Preemptive Strike Index. Basically, RNG-1 is used to determine encounter formations and if the encounter is a preemptive strike or an ambush. While the data was incredible, it wasn't that useful in its current form. So Gray Fox made a script that shows the ambushes and preemptives from the RNG seed and posted it on June 17th. Not even a couple days after that, more advancements were made by Crimson Inferno using Rossi's encounter RNG info and encounter tables Crimson had been researching up to Mushroom Rock Road. Things slowed down for a bit, because Crimson was still reverse engineering the encounter tables for the rest of the game. But in July, the things started to heat back up again when Rossi posted the raw values for RNG 10, 12, and 13. Using this information, Crimson and Gray Fox were able to rewrite it to make it usable. This allowed them to not only do that, but to also calculate the next RNG value based off of the previous one. Over the course of the next several days, Crimson and Rossi worked through some of the kinks that didn't make sense with the RNG 10 advancing, including finding out that the Bevel Monk's rifles and flamethrowers count as enemies that advance RNG 10. It is actually speculated that the developers intended for the monks to have holdable weapons that could be destroyed and dropped, but the concept didn't make it past them being counted as enemies in the game's memory. While this was all happening, Gray Fox also looked into the prize structure for a ghost, which is basically the drop table, and eventually made a tool for the equipment drops. However, for the tracker to work properly, it actually needed the prize structure from every enemy that runners fought in the speedrun. This was a list of 43 enemies total, so it would take a good amount of effort to get all these tracked. Thankfully, this didn't take long, because Rossi was able to get the raw data to Crimson Inferno, and on July 11th, Crimson Inferno posted a file showing all of the prize structures for the listed enemies. Gray Fox was able to use this to make the first full RNG tracker for the PC version of the game. A few days after that, Crimson actually updated his tracker workbook to a new version that not only included the seeds from before, but now the RNG tracker that Gray Fox developed, putting all of the tools needed to perform the manipulated run in one place. After a few more instances of figuring out how the game handles multiple enemies being killed at once, among other things, Gray Fox updates his tracker once again, and this time it uses a file that Rossi provided, showing all of the RNG information from the 256 seeds on the HD remaster. Using this information, runners were able to perform their own runs with the RNG manipulation, including Crimson Inferno getting an 8-hour, 52-minute, and 3-second PB on July 26, 2021. You would think that this would be all of the manipulation possible, but there actually was more to be looked at. On the 29th of July, Gray Fox was actually able to update his tracker to include damage, critical hit, and escape RNG overall. These use RNG 20 through RNG 26 for each party member respectively, and RNG 27 for Seymour and the Aeons. Without going into much detail about how these exactly work, one thing can be said for certain. Being able to manipulate not only encounters and item drops, but also critical hits was a massive win for the community. The last update to come from Gray Fox was actually on October 3rd, less than a week ago as of this writing, where he included a way to properly track all of the PS2 RNG and Yojimbo's attack RNG on the HD remaster. With the deep dive into RNG manipulation out of the way, what does this mean for the Final Fantasy X community? Well, community leaders had the forethought to separate the HD remaster's console any % category into set seed manipped and non-manipped, since setting the system clock directly affects what kind of seed you can generate. Since the PC and PS2 versions don't have pre-run setup when it comes to RNG tracking, those categories allow seed tracking as normal, thus making RNG tracking essential for top runners. Gray Fox and another runner named Camper were also able to use the newly made Yojimbo tracker to beat Penance in the PC HD remaster with manipulation, driving times down immensely. As for the any % category on the PC version, several runners have pushed their times down, and a couple down to sub 8 hours and 50 minutes without loads. 20 years after the game's PS2 release, the rush to push Final Fantasy X to its limits has come to a head, with more runners adopting the seed manipulation and others making use of the RNG values for even more manipulation. The randomness that this game drove runners mad with has finally started down the path of being tamed. Even though so many developments have been made, who knows what could be next? Thanks for watching.